In the summer of 1944, while the Second World War was still being fought on two continents, 44 countries sent delegates to a hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. They were not there to negotiate a ceasefire. They were there to design the world that would come after the war. 3 weeks of negotiations. 2 new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. One currency placed at the center of the global financial system. And one country that walked out of that hotel as the undisputed architect of the post-war economic order. The United States had done something that no military victory could have achieved alone. It had built the infrastructure of dominance, the rules, the institutions, the currency arrangements that would make American power self-reinforcing for the next 80 years. Here is what nobody in the mainstream conversation is saying clearly. China is doing the same thing. Right now, in 2026. Not with a conference in a mountain hotel, not with a dramatic announcement, but region by region, institution by institution, currency agreement by currency agreement. China is building the architecture of the next global order, and the method is identical to 1944, because there is only one method that has ever worked. To understand what China is doing, you have to understand what America actually did in 1944, because most people think Bretton Woods was about the dollar. It wasn't. The dollar was the end result. What Bretton Woods was actually about was dependency. The United States in 1944 held roughly 75% of the world's monetary gold. It was the only major industrial power not physically devastated by the war. It was the world's largest oil producer. And it was offering something that every war-exhausted country desperately needed. Access. Access to its market. Access to its capital. Access to the stability of a functioning financial system. Countries didn't adopt the dollar because they loved America. They adopted the dollar because the dollar was attached to the only system that worked. And once you build your trade flows, your debt structures, your central bank reserves around one currency and one set of institutions, you don't easily leave. That is dependency. And dependency, maintained at scale, is what made American hegemony last. Now look at what China is doing, and look at where it is doing it. Africa. As of May 1st, 2026, China implemented zero-tariff treatment on 100% of tariff lines for 53 African countries. Every country on the continent with diplomatic ties to Beijing, which means every country except Eswatini, which recognizes Taiwan, can now export to China without paying import duties. No reciprocity required. China asks nothing in return on tariffs. Let's take a step back, because this is the moment to ask the real question. Why would the world's second-largest economy voluntarily give up tariff revenue from 53 countries simultaneously? The answer is not generosity. The answer is 1944. In 1944, the United States offered market access and financial stability to countries that had no other viable option. The offer was asymmetric. America got more than it gave in pure economic terms. But the countries that accepted built their recovery around the American system. And once you've done that, the switching costs become enormous. China is making the same calculation in Africa. The continent has a combined population that will reach 2.5 billion by 2050. It holds the majority of the world's reserves of cobalt, lithium, manganese, and platinum, the minerals that the next energy system runs on. And until this year, African countries face significant tariff barriers accessing the Chinese market, while simultaneously losing preferential access to the American market, as AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, was allowed to expire in September 2025. China stepped into that vacuum, not with aid, with architecture. Zero-tariff access, Belt and Road infrastructure, yuan-denominated trade settlements, Chinese banks, Chinese payment systems. What's particularly revealing is the one country excluded from this arrangement, Eswatini, the only African nation that still recognizes Taiwan. Its exclusion is not punitive in tone. Beijing frames it as a simple diplomatic condition, but the signal is unmistakable. Market access is contingent on geopolitical alignment. That is exactly how the United States used the Marshall Plan. You receive the benefits of the system by operating within its political logic. Now let's move to Southeast Asia, because this is where the parallel to 1944 becomes almost uncomfortable in its precision. In 1944, the United States was the dominant trade partner for most of Asia. American capital financed reconstruction. American military presence provided security. And American institutions set the rules for how trade was denominated and settled. Today, China is the largest trading partner for every major Southeast Asian economy. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, all of them trade more with China than with the United States. And China has been systematically building the financial infrastructure to match that trade dominance. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, processed the equivalent of $245 trillion in yuan-denominated transactions in 2025. That is not a pilot program. That is operational infrastructure at scale, providing a settlement alternative to the dollar-denominated SWIFT system. In parallel, mBridge, a cross-border central bank digital currency platform, has processed $55 billion in payments, with 95% of transactions in digital yuan. The central banks of Thailand, the UAE, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia are all participants. The Bank for International Settlements withdrew from the project in late 2024, officially over concerns about sanctioned countries having access. But the platform kept running without them. And here is what you need to understand about that. When the BIS withdrew, it expected mBridge to lose legitimacy. Instead, it gained independence. The platform is now operating outside the Western-controlled multilateral framework entirely, which is precisely the point. In 1944, every country that wanted to participate in the global financial system had to go through institutions the United States controlled: the IMF, the World Bank, the dollar clearing system. The leverage was total because there was no alternative infrastructure. China is not trying to destroy those institutions. China is building parallel infrastructure. The goal is not to make the dollar irrelevant overnight. The goal is to make the dollar optional. And once the dollar is optional rather than mandatory, the entire structure of American financial leverage begins to erode. Now let's go to Latin America, a region that has historically been treated as the United States' exclusive sphere of influence. In 2023, Brazilian President Lula asked publicly, "Why should every country in the world have to conduct trade in dollars? Why can't BRICS develop a settlement currency?" That question was treated as symbolic by most Western analysts. It was not symbolic. Brazil and China have been progressively settling bilateral trade in reais and yuan, bypassing dollar intermediaries entirely. Argentina has used yuan-denominated swap lines from China's central bank to meet IMF obligations, settling its reserve requirements in Chinese currency rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia and China have conducted oil settlements in yuan. Iraq and China have traded in yuan. More than 80 countries are now actively reducing their dollar dependence in trade settlements. Russia and China settle roughly 90% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. None of this individually is catastrophic for the dollar. The yuan still accounts for only 2 to 3% of global transactions by SWIFT measures. The dollar remains dominant. But in June 2026, the European Central Bank reported something that has barely been covered in the mainstream financial press. Gold has overtaken U.S. Treasuries as the largest reserve asset held by foreign central banks. Gold now accounts for 27% of global reserves. U.S. Treasuries, 22%. That is the first time since Bretton Woods that treasuries have not been the primary reserve asset of foreign central banks. And it happened quietly, while most analysts were watching other things. This is how structural transitions work, not with a single dramatic rupture, with a slow, cumulative repositioning that only becomes visible when the threshold has already been crossed. Let me now connect this back to the 1944 parallel, because there is one dimension of China's strategy that is almost never discussed, and it is the most important one. In 1944, the United States didn't just build financial institutions, it built security institutions. NATO, the U.S.-Japan alliance, the U.S.-South Korea alliance, bilateral defense arrangements across the Middle East. The logic was explicit. If you are inside the American security umbrella, you are also inside the American economic system. Security dependency and financial dependency reinforced each other. China is replicating this dynamic, but without the military alliances, at least not yet. Instead, China is using what could be called infrastructure dependency. The Belt and Road Initiative has financed ports, railways, power plants, and communication networks across Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. When a country's primary port was financed by Chinese capital, built by Chinese contractors, and operates on Chinese logistics software, the switching costs of pivoting away from China become enormous. This is the 1944 move, not military occupation, infrastructure entanglement. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka is the case study everyone uses. Sri Lanka couldn't service its debt to China. China took a 99-year lease on the port. But the deeper story is not the debt trap. It's that every subsequent government in Sri Lanka has had to factor Chinese interests into its strategic calculations in a way that simply wasn't true before the port existed. Multiply that across dozens of countries. Across the ports, China has financed in Pakistan, Kenya, Tanzania, Greece, Myanmar. Across the railways in Ethiopia, the power plants in Zimbabwe, the 5G networks being built on Huawei infrastructure across Southeast Asia. What nobody is mentioning is that by the time this infrastructure is built, by the time the port is operational, the railway is running. The payment system is integrated. The political conversation about whether to align with China or with the United States has already been structurally pre-answered. The economics make the politics. That is what Bretton Woods did, and that is what China is doing. But here is where the parallel breaks down, and this matters enormously for what comes next. In 1944, the United States was offering a genuinely damaged world, a system that worked. European economies were destroyed. Asian economies were in ruins. The dollar system wasn't just American, it was functional. Countries adopted it because it solved a real problem. China's parallel architecture has a critical vulnerability. It is built, in significant part, on Chinese state capital, Chinese state institutions, and Chinese state interests. The yuan is not freely convertible. Chinese capital controls mean that holding yuan reserves carries risks that holding dollar reserves does not. CIPS and Enbridge are functional, but they lack the depth and liquidity of the SWIFT dollar system that has 70 years of accumulated infrastructure behind it. This is the constraint that limits how far and how fast the parallel architecture can spread. Countries want an alternative to dollar dependence, but they are not uniformly eager to exchange dollar dependence for yuan dependence. What most of them want is optionality, the ability to choose. And optionality is exactly what China's architecture is providing, even if yuan dominance is not the destination. So where does this go from here? The first scenario is successful parallel architecture. China's infrastructure investments bind enough of the global south into yuan settlement systems, CIPS payment flows, and Belt and Road economic dependency that a genuinely multipolar financial system emerges by the mid-2030s. The dollar remains the primary reserve currency, but loses its status as the only viable settlement currency. American financial leverage, the ability to impose sanctions, to cut countries off from the global financial system, is permanently reduced. This scenario requires China to manage its own economic stability through the transition, which is not guaranteed. The second scenario is American countermobilization. The United States recognizes the structural challenge and responds with its own market access and infrastructure. Offers to the global south genuine alternatives to Belt and Road, genuine preferential trade arrangements for Africa and Southeast Asia. The difficulty is that the U.S. political system has shown, across multiple administrations, a limited appetite for the kind of long-term, non-reciprocal economic engagement that this countermove would require. AGOA was allowed to expire. U.S. aid was dismantled. The political logic runs in the opposite direction. The third scenario, and again, the most structurally likely, is managed competition between two parallel systems. Neither the dollar nor the yuan achieves dominance. Countries build redundant financial infrastructure, maintaining dollar relationships for Western trade, developing yuan settlement capacity for China trade, and gradually reducing the premium they place on any single system's reliability. This is already happening. The question is not whether this transition occurs, the question is how disruptive the transition is. History shows that when a dominant power's financial architecture begins to face genuine structural competition for the first time, the response of that dominant power determines whether the transition is managed or chaotic. In 1971, when Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility, it was because the existing architecture was no longer sustainable. The world adapted eventually. The transition was turbulent, but not catastrophic. Whether the current transition is turbulent or catastrophic depends on decisions being made right now in Beijing, in Washington, and in the capitals of the 70 or 80 countries that are quietly choosing which infrastructure to build their futures around. Honestly, which scenario do you think is most likely? And which country do you think is making the smarter long-term play, China with its parallel architecture or the United States with its existing institutional dominance? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. So let me bring this together. In 1944, the United States used a moment of unrivaled structural advantage to build an economic order that served American interests for 80 years. It did this not through military conquest but through architecture. Market access, institutions, currency arrangements, infrastructure dependency. In 2026, China is executing the same playbook. Zero-tariff access for 53 African nations. Belt and road infrastructure across 3 continents. CIPS processing $245 trillion in yuan transactions. Bridge operating independently of Western financial oversight. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Argentina, Brazil, settling trade in yuan. No individual piece of this is decisive, but the architecture, taken together, is the most consequential geopolitical project since Bretton Woods. And the reason it is not being widely recognized as such is the same reason Bretton Woods itself was not initially recognized as what it was. Because the most important shifts in power don't announce themselves. They build quietly until one day the infrastructure is already there and the politics simply catch up. The next shift is not coming. It is already in motion. Stay sharp. The next shift is already in motion.